Well, once again, the government has been dragged kicking and screaming to bring this legislative instrument into the Parliament today after the Coalition has been calling on this for several weeks. I welcome the fact that later this morning the Minister advised me that he'd be doing this after question time today, and that's a welcome development. For the last 2-3 weeks since the legislation was passed, this government has had no legal authority to send anyone anywhere, and I think having that uncertainty out there has created an ambiguity that was just simply not necessary and could have been addressed some weeks ago. That said, I think it's a positive step that we'll see that legislative instrument for Nauru introduced into the Parliament this afternoon, or rather the motion to endorse that legislative instrument this afternoon. I look forward to seeing the government members who have denounced and derided and demonised Nauru for more than a decade now have to admit, by voting to support the designation of Nauru this afternoon, that this government got it horrifically wrong 4.5 years ago when they decided to close all of this down, and we all know the chaos, cost and tragedy that has resulted from that decision, which this government can never walk away from. They can never walk away from their accountability in terms of the policy failings of the last 4.5 years, and we will continue to see the legacy of those failings on our own shores for many, many years to come. Well over 10,000 people are still in this country as we speak, going through the system, full access to appeals through the courts, and will be doing that for many years to come, and the costs and other things associated with that will continue. But for those who have turned up in the last 4 weeks, the 1,800 people who have turned up and more in the last 4 weeks, we will now have what is effectively an asylum lottery take place to decide who will go to Nauru. But the more important issue, frankly, is this, and that is, from today, any boat and any person who turns up on a boat must go to Nauru. No exceptions. They all must go to Nauru from this point on. The government says they are now in a position to send people there, then send them there they must. And any exceptions to that, I think, will only dilute what is already a half-hearted message that this government is seeking to send. We have always said, and will be saying again today, that the government cannot expect Howard government outcomes if they're not prepared to put the full suite of Howard government measures in place. And so we do call on them again, not just to Nauru, temporary protection visas, turning boats back where it is safe to do so. These are the core elements of the package that is necessary, a package that this government continues to reject. And I think as long as they can continue to do that, Australians will continue to question their resolve, as the people smugglers always have. But the Coalition will support the endorsement of that designation today in the House of Representatives, and as soon as it is introduced into the Senate as well. But we will continue to make the point that it is essential that all people who arrive from here on in must go to Nauru.
Morrison, do you maintain that it's much more easy to mount a legal challenge if asylum seekers step foot on Australia rather than go directly to Nauru?
Well, I think that is absolutely the case, and the experience proves that. And the government will have to address that in the weeks ahead, and the longer someone spends here, then obviously the opportunity for that increases. Let's not forget how the injunction regarding the Malaysia agreement took place. It was the government's slowness in implementing that agreement outside the original timetable they set, which allowed the injunction to be put in place in the first place. So the government's allowing 1,800 people now to have arrived, and it took 19 days for the Howard government to get it up and running. I noticed the Minister made a comment on that today. He referred to the time period that we were talking about permanent facilities being put in place in Nauru, not temporary facilities. John Howard had it up in 19 days. This government has taken more than 4 weeks, it will be, and the circumstances when John Howard did it were far more trying and far more challenging than today.
Mr. Morrison, fill up immediately if you send every boat there?
Sorry, Mark, I didn't hear the start.
Sorry, wouldn't Nauru fill up immediately if you sent every boat there, and then what would you do? Would you just increase the capacity, or what?
Well, I noticed that the President said there's a potential capacity there for 3,000 on the weekend, but the issue here is sending and implementing a consistent message. And that is, the government can have all the YouTube videos they like, but at the end of the day, it's what you do that counts. And people must understand that if they get on a boat and come to Australia, they will head to Nauru, no exceptions. And even today, I think the government is mincing its words on this issue. And that only undermines the message that they must send. But the message they must send must be sent with their actions more than anything. And that's the challenge that now confronts them, and we will see how they address that.
But if you do that, you won't have 3,000 there, you'll have 10,000, 12,000.
Well, what I'm saying is everyone who turns up from this point, the government will have to conduct their asylum lottery about how many people they send to Nauru from those who have already turned up, and I'll leave those judgments to the government. And we've made no comments about how many should be sent. I'll leave that judgment to the government, but I do think with the delays that have taken place, that issue has become more problematic than it needed to be. Chris?
Mr. Morrison, are you concerned that if you keep saying that this policy is going to fail, that it will become a self-fulfilling prophecy?
Well, I haven't said that, Chris.
You seem to be saying that over and over again.
Well, that's what you're saying, but that's not what I'm saying. So it would be nice if people actually raise points with things I've said rather than things they may want to put in my mouth.
Do you think that what the government is doing now will succeed in stopping the boats?
Well, what I have said consistently, as long as I have been in this role, and what the Coalition has said for more than a decade, is you cannot expect Howard government outcomes without the full suite of Howard government policies. Now, that is our consistent position, and we stick to that position 100%. Now, the government is going to chance their arm with some half-hearted measures, some less than half measures, and if they expect to get the results of the Howard government in doing that, well, that's a matter for them to look forward to, but it doesn't concur with our assessment.
Mr. Morrison, could you explain to me the...
Sorry, David?
Can you clarify your position on Sri Lanka? The Minister was pointing out it's not a signatory to the Refugees Convention. You want to send people back there. What is the Coalition's position?
Well, I think the Minister has been very disingenuous in how he sought to characterise what has been said there. What Julie Bishop and I said very plainly was people intercepted outside of our waters, in the same way that people intercepted between here and Indonesia, or frankly, people prevented from leaving Sri Lanka or leaving Indonesia. The UNHCR actually defines processes of interception and preventing people from leaving the country from which they're leaving as being the same process. It's not offshore processing. It's actually disruption and return. Now, that is our policy. There is no surprise that the Coalition says we will turn boats back where it's safe to do so. That is our policy. It relates to Sri Lanka, it relates to Indonesia, it relates to from wherever the boats will come, and the smugglers know it. Now, we think we should be working closely with Sri Lanka to ensure that people who would be subject to that policy, there'd be appropriate arrangements in place, there would be observers, as occurred with Vietnam when people returned to Vietnam during the Indo-Chinese crisis in the wake of that. I mean, these are the discussions they should be having with Sri Lanka, working through those details. It's many years since the conflict ceased, and I think they can work constructively with Sri Lanka to get such an arrangement in place. But as usual, Chris Bowen goes into his well-worn excuse book and will give you just yet another reason why he can't do it. Now, he dipped into his same excuse book to say why he could never do Nauru. And here we are, standing today, and the Labor Party will be voting this afternoon to reopen Nauru.
So Mr. Morrison, just in continuation of that, I mean, the Paris Aristotle in that report, they actually, even though they said there's problems with Malaysia, they still said it was a vital part of making this trade stop. Are you just completely not interested in if the government does manage to get a deal over the line with the Malaysian government? Is there just no way the Coalition will revisit its view on Malaysia if Nauru and Manus don't work?
I think you're clearing a lot of hurdles there for the government, Phil, before they've even got to any of them. So I don't feel the need to respond to an agreement that hasn't even been completed in relation to Malaysia. We've always thought that Malaysia has serious flaws, not just on the absence of legally binding protections, but the the cap that they have in place and the exceptions that apply. I've raised those endlessly with the Minister, and I note that they've not made any progress on those things since January, when I first raised with them, not just in more recent times. So I don't feel the need to respond to a mirage of a policy which, frankly, I don't see going anywhere. Our position, I think, on those things have been fairly plain.